Hi everyone, welcome to the Light Journal podcast. I'm Jamie Perez. In this episode, I'd like to tackle a very different type of topic. How the type of language into which we're born actually influences our worldview and our spirituality. I got interested in this topic after beginning an audiobook of Alan Watts' Introduction to Zen Buddhism. I haven't even gotten into the meat of the book and I'm already floored. He begins the book by simply discussing the differences between Western and Eastern cultures. I thought I was fairly well versed in these differences since I had studied similar topics in regards to Western and Mideastern cultures. But that didn't make a difference here because Eastern cultures are their own entity and they should not be conflated with the Mideast. In particular, Watt mentioned that Eastern cultures tend to think holistically or ecologically, whereas Western cultures tend to think more analytically or categorically, and this is reflected in the language as it is spoken and written. So, if asked to categorize three objects, such as a panda, a monkey, and a banana, an Asian is more likely to link the monkey and banana by the verb eat, whereas a Westerner is more likely to link panda and monkey by the category of mammals. This distinction isn't just about which culture emphasizes verbs or nouns. It actually reflects an innate perspective of the world. So ask yourself, when you think of the world, do you define people, nature, and other stuff by what it is, or by how it's connected and related to other things? Researchers did an experiment to determine whether Eastern and Western cultures favor nouns or verbs when learning a language. Each were given an animated image to describe. Asians were more likely to focus on the relationships between objects and the environment, such as fish eating squid, swimming in the coral reef, etc. By contrast, the Westerners were more likely to focus on individual objects such as a fish, squid, coral, ocean, and that sort of thing. Asians use what is known as a high context language. That means understanding what's being spoken depends on knowing what's happening in the environment, the context of the conversation, who is speaking and who's listening, an agreed upon cultural understanding, body language and facial expressions, and other nonverbal cues. Words can have multiple meanings based on context. Without context, the language is difficult, if not impossible, to understand, because words or phrases that are obvious to both the speaker and listener will be omitted. They're not even going to mention it, and that just leaves words that sound like nonsense when put together. For example, I'm going to watch a movie becomes movie watch. In Chinese languages, the languages are so dependent on context, they can't be understood without it. By contrast, Westerners, including Europeans, use a predominantly low-context language. That means our language disregards the environment. It is a very literal and direct way of speech, and there's very little left to interpretation. That means the language speaks for itself without regard to things like social status or age of the speaker or listener, without regard to the surrounding environment, without regard to what one is doing at the moment, without regard to any shared cultural understanding or any other unspoken cues. That makes it particularly difficult for Westerners and Asians to really communicate effectively, because what's polite in one culture is considered rude in the other, and what is obvious in one culture is considered obscure or even indecipherable in the other. This takes on even more significance when one culture appropriates the sacred texts or philosophical writings of the other and interprets it based on their own pre-existing language and perspective. The result is not an accurate rendering of their original writings, but more of a syncretism or merging of two different worldviews into something that's brand new. And I would say at that point, it actually deserves a new name to identify it as something different than the original, because it is different than the original. I can think of a few examples right off the top of my head. Western society has adopted Reiki from the Japanese, but in the process changed it into something new. Thus, it really isn't Reiki, it's a westernized version of it. The same is true of westernized interpretations of Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, shamanism, mantras, Taoism, Taoism, Shintoism, and so on and so forth. I believe one of the reasons Western societies like to keep the original name of these belief systems is because it lends a certain amount of historical credibility and authority to these reinterpreted, synchronized belief systems. But in truth, none of these westernized belief systems accurately reflect the intent and meaning of the original Eastern and Mideastern cultures in which they developed. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, but it does add a layer of confusion to communication between Western and Eastern practitioners of that particular form of spirituality or philosophy. And it can also be seen as disrespectful by the originating culture. There's another aspect to this topic that really blows my mind. I don't know whether the worldview created the language or the language created the worldview, but it doesn't take more than a cursory look at these two cultures to see that low or high context languages tend to mirror the worldview of the speakers, as seen in decision-making in everyday life. Asians value community and have philosophies and religions that promote a holistic relationship with the world. Westerners value individuality and have philosophies and religions that promote a person-centric mindset. It seems to me that Eastern high-context languages require people to be more present in the moment, more aware of their surroundings, because context is everything. Just to properly greet someone in Korean, you have to know their age and social status. In Chinese languages, the meaning of words change depending on the speaker's gestures, stance, and tone, as well as social and contextual cues. The Japanese will hint at their meanings using subtle social cues like body language and facial expressions, rather than stating something outright. So to communicate, the listeners have to pay attention to the speaker. This requires attention and presence in the moment. Paying attention isn't just about the person, but the environment. A word's meaning changes based on what the speaker is doing. It's about the relationship between the speaker and the environment, society, etc. Unsurprisingly then, harmony becomes a priority, and this is seen in how these cultures view their environment and other people. Harmony and sharing are a priority and part of the common cultural experience. Nothing happens independently of something else. What hurts you hurts me. Everything is interconnected when a person is defined by the greater community and the surrounding environment. Consider then some of the Asian philosophical traditions, such as Taoism, Buddhism, and Confucianism. These all emphasize the interconnectedness of all things, as do their indigenous pantheistic and animistic beliefs found in things like shamanism, Taoism, Shintoism, and Hinduism. These belief systems all teach the essential interconnectivity and harmony between the earth and humanity. Humans in nature are seen as part of a unified, dynamic, and interconnected whole that encourages people to extend their moral concern to all things in nature. By contrast, Western cultures use a low-context language where the words and syntax stand on their own. Words make sense without knowing who you're speaking to, what's happening around you, or other social constructs. The language is explicit and self-explanatory, so you don't need to be self-aware, present, or in the moment, because the language is understood apart from the environment and social cues. Well, this reflects the Western attitude of individuality distinctiveness, and separation from the greater whole. It is a reductionist mentality that places the well-being of oneself above the community and above nature itself. Western religions tend to be guided by exceptionalism. As a general rule, Western religions make a clear distinction between humans and everything else. Humans possess the soul, the eternal life, and the blessings of their Creator. Humans, and only humans, possess the right to life. Everything else on the planet, including the planet itself, is viewed as separate from humanity, here solely for human use. By denying the sentience of everything else, Western culture gives itself permission to exterminate, cull, and ravage nature for its own benefit, without recognizing humanity's dependence upon the earth for its own survival. This is particularly evident in how decisions are made regarding nature in our Western society. I'd like to give you an example of this. From the 1880s, when Yellowstone National Park was created, the Army, and later the park rangers, viewed wolves as a nuisance predator, mostly because it interfered with the cattle ranchers. Well, in 1907, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service began a predator control program designed to kill off all the wolves in the area. They didn't think wolves had a right to live in Yellowstone anymore since they had claimed it for themselves. By 1926, the rangers had killed them all. Scientists visited Yellowstone a mere 3 years later, and then another 4 years after that, and this is what they wrote. The range was in deplorable condition when we first saw it, and its deterioration has been progressing steadily since then. Well, what happened? Without the wolves protecting Yellowstone, the elk population exploded so much that for the next 30 years, the park rangers resorted to killing them too. But that didn't help the ecosystem. It just kept it from getting worse. By the 1960s, there weren't enough elk for the hunters, so, under threat of defunding by the U.S. government, the park rangers stopped killing the elk. And once again, Yellowstone began to rapidly degrade because the elk population exploded. The exploding populations of elk overgrazed the land and trees. Without trees, the songbirds that spread tree seeds left. The beavers had no wood to build dams, so the streams began to erode. Willows couldn't grow in the degraded streams, so the river was unprotected from the sun. The stream became too hot for the cold water fish, so they began dying out. Yellowstone's ecosystem was dying because Western thinkers didn't see holistically, but individually, and were human-centric instead of nature-centric. They didn't see the value in any other form of life but their own. Fortunately, some people learned from this situation, and with the reintroduction of wolves to the region, within a decade, the ecological balance of Yellowstone began to improve. In the same vein, in the 1970s, Western-thinking ecologists believed elephants were causing desertification in what is now known as Zambia. So they killed over 40,000 elephants to save the African savanna. Once again, these ecologists didn't believe animals had a right to live if it didn't suit human interests. Well, not only did this mass destruction fail, it made the savanna degrade even faster. What these ecologists didn't understand at the time was how savannas depend upon the elephants. Quote, "These herds grazed, defecated, stomped, and salivated as they moved around, building soil and deepening plant roots. Without the constant activity of large numbers of bunched animals, the biological cycle of birth, growth, death, and decay was interrupted, and the grasslands and their once rich soils turned into dry, exposed desert land." Unquote. Just like the Yellowstone Park Rangers, these ecologists saw nature as a bunch of individual parts instead of an interconnected whole, and they placed no value on the life of the animals that had been living there for thousands of years. I realize that I used two really dramatic examples of how Westerners think in parts and pieces rather than in relationships, but I imagine most people listening to this podcast can think of numerous examples within their own life. A common shared example would be all the pesticides we use not just in the house, but in the yard, in our fields, in our gardens. Insects are the foundation for all life. Without insects, the world dies. I don't know which came first, language or culture, and I don't know if it even matters, but it seems clear to me that low-context languages like English instill a sense of separation between us and everything else from the moment we begin learning to speak. This is then reinforced by our schools, religions, society, to the point that we become oblivious to our interdependence with all that is. Putting everything and everyone into categories that are then labeled as useful or not, worthy or not, sentient or not, becomes a convenient way to use, ignore, or discard anybody or anything at will. The way we speak without true awareness of who we are, where we are, or our present environment keeps us focused more on the past and future than on the present. The way we promote human exceptionalism devalues the earth as a living organism and puts the entire planet into jeopardy. It all starts with language, but it's our decision whether that language structure is going to define us. Languages are always changing, and so are we. So why not use our ability to change by focusing on what unifies instead of divides, what brings harmony instead of discord, what works with nature instead of against it, what builds up instead of tearing down. Instead of categorizing and labeling people, places, and things, why not describe their relationships and interdependence instead? How we communicate is a choice, and I think it's time to choose differently than what we have before. Thanks for listening. I'm Jamie Perez with the Light Journal Podcast. If you'd like to learn more about the citations that I used in this podcast, please see the descriptions below or visit me on my website at thelightjournal.online. Blessings on your journey, everyone.